Blake Lively was not just another name in the headlines. Anymore, she had become something else, something colder, something calculated. Her lawyers arrived without smiles, their folders too thick, their eyes too sharp, and when the doors to the courtroom closed, it was like the outside world didn't exist anymore, only the strategy, the silence, and the secret motions that moved faster than truth could keep up, with no cameras, no statements, no leaks, just quiet papers and heavy looks in every document. Filed felt like a warning to stay away from whatever she was hiding. The judge barely looked up. The bailiff seemed bored, but those who knew what was really happening knew that this wasn't just about one subpoena or one lawsuit. This was about rewriting reality with money and timing and fear, and every time Justin Baldoni tried to speak, his words felt swallowed by something invisible, something cruel, and even though his evidence was real, his voice never landed right, never loud enough, never safe. And when he said that Blake was using her celebrity to manipulate the system, the reaction was not shock but silence, the kind of silence that meant everyone already knew, and no one was going to say a word. And that was when it hit him. This wasn't about winning, this was about surviving, and he wasn't even sure anymore if he would. The moment Justin Baldoni stepped out of the courtroom, he felt the weight of eyes, not from fans or reporters, but from watchers, people who had no names, only intention, shadows behind tinted glass cars that never stayed long enough to be followed, and every message he received felt like it came late, like someone was reading them first. And when he tried to contact the original whistleblower, she was gone, her number disconnected, her apartment cleared out as if she had never existed. And the more he looked, the more empty spaces he found, statements, missing files, redacted witnesses, refusing to testify, not out of loyalty but out of fear. And then came the cease and desist letters, not one, not two, but a stream of them, each colder than the last, all perfectly worded, all dripping with the kind of control only someone like Blake could buy. And behind them was a name he hadn't expected. A private firm known for silencing problems, not solving them, the kind that made scandals vanish not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. And still Blake Lively said nothing, no denial, no interview, just one appearance outside a charity gala, smiling, waving as if her world wasn't falling apart from the inside. And yet it wasn't her world falling, it was everyone else's, because with each legal maneuver she didn't just defend herself, she attacked, strategically removing pieces from the board. And every time Justin tried to respond, he found fewer tools, fewer allies. And now he wasn't just fighting her, he was fighting the idea of her, the image, the illusion, the perfectly crafted narrative that no one dared challenge. Not in court, not in public, not even in private. And that was when he realized this wasn't a scandal, it was a strategy, and he was already too deep to escape without scars. It started with a tip from someone he didn't trust but couldn't ignore. A single line sent through an encrypted channel saying, "Look into the settlement from 2 years ago." The one with the confidentiality clause and the payout that vanished into offshore accounts. And Justin Baldoni didn't want to believe it, but he followed it anyway, and what he found wasn't one case, it was three buried complaints, all sealed, all dismissed quietly, with signatures that barely looked like they belonged to real people. And in each one the same pattern emerged: names erased, timelines blurred, and a mysterious consulting firm listed as intermediary, one that didn't show up on any official records but kept surfacing around Blake Lively's circle. And when he traced the financials, it got worse, donations funneled through shell companies, event fees inflated beyond reason, speaking engagements paid in cash, and somehow it all tied back to a nonprofit that no longer existed except on paper. And when he tried to bring this to the authorities, he was told to wait, to be patient, to let the system work. But every hour he waited, another witness backed out, another file was locked. And then the smear campaigns began, not against Blake but against him, articles questioning his credibility, sudden posts accusing him of bias, edited clips of old interviews twisted out of context. And even his inner circle began to fracture one by one. Contacts ghosted him, supporters distanced themselves, and all the while Blake stayed silent, no rebuttal, no emotion, just perfection. Smiling in front of cameras, hugging her children, walking red carpets like nothing was wrong. And maybe for her nothing was wrong because everything was going exactly how she planned. And now Justin understood this wasn't about clearing his name or proving guilt, it was about exposing something bigger than a lawsuit. It was about showing the world that power, when unchecked, becomes something far more dangerous than anyone ever admits, and once unleashed, it does not stop until it rewrites everything. The night before his next appearance in court, Justin Baldoni didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every message he opened brought new threats, some subtle, others blunt, some pretending to be friendly, just a word of caution, some written in ways That left no doubt about what would happen if he kept digging, and when he looked out his window, there was always a car parked across the street, always empty. Always quiet, headlights off, engine running just long enough to be noticed, then gone. And his phone would ring once, then stop, and when he picked it up, nothing, silence, and he realized he wasn't being warned, he was being hunted. Not physically, not yet, but reputationally, legally, emotionally, piece by piece, his life was being shredded. Not with force, but with finesse, and as he walked into the courthouse the next morning, cameras flashed not for him, but for her, Blake. Lively, stepping out like a queen draped in calm confidence, every movement curated, every expression flawless, and inside the courtroom, her legal team sat like a machine, folders opened before they were needed. Objections timed. Not to block truth, but to drown it in noise, and even when he spoke, even when he laid out the timeline, the receipts, the accounts, it didn't matter because by then the story wasn't about what was true, it was about who was more believable, and Blake had spent years perfecting her. Believability, every award, every cover, every flawless headline, and now he saw the truth wasn't being denied, it was being replaced because, in her world, truth was not something to defend, it was something to design, and he was too late to stop it, too small to resist it, too isolated to survive it, and yet something inside him refused to fold. Because he knew that if he stayed quiet, if he walked away, then this would keep happening again and again, and no one would ever see the line she crossed because she had erased the line altogether. When Justin Baldoni left the courthouse, he thought it was over, not the case, not the fight, but the chance to be heard, because everything he said, everything he proved had been ignored, diluted, or twisted into something unrecognizable. And as he stepped into the cold light outside, a reporter tried to ask him a question, but even their voice sounded rehearsed, like they were told what to ask and what not to see, and that was when it hit him. The story wasn't being buried, it was being rewritten, and not by accident. Blake Lively's team didn't deny the accusations, they reframed them, they turned the focus away from the evidence and onto his tone. His past, his motive, and headlines followed, not saying he was wrong, but that he was angry, that he was dramatic, that he was struggling personally. And suddenly the narrative shifted from facts to feelings, and feelings were easier to control, and then came the sudden statements from people he trusted, people who once stood beside him, now offering lukewarm quotes or distancing themselves altogether. And one by one his allies faded, and yet Blake said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence became her defense, and her silence was louder than any denial. And while his team scrambled to protect what was left, she walked into events dressed in elegant, shaking hands with politicians, smiling with executives, while whispers of legal threats followed anyone who mentioned the case, and he realized then that she didn't need to win in court because she had already won in perception, and perception was more powerful than justice and more lasting than truth. And even if he had the proof, he couldn't force the world to care, not when every platform, every outlet, every whisper was shaped by fear of retaliation or hope for access. And now he was fighting alone, not just against her, but against the version of her that had been built over years, a version immune to consequence, armored in celebrity, and powered by silence. He started noticing things that didn't make sense, like how court transcripts were delayed without reason, how emails to court clerks bounced back, how video footage from certain hearings vanished from archives, how his own legal filings were edited ever so slightly after submission, enough to change tone, enough to discredit him, but never enough to prove tampering. And when he asked about it, no one had answers, just apologies and confusion and more silence. Always silence, and he wondered how far her reach really went, because this wasn't just money. This was orchestration, this was control over systems that weren't supposed to bend, but they were bending for her, or maybe they were breaking, and if they were breaking for her, who else had they broken for? And still she didn't blink, not once. Not even when new claims emerged from people outside the courtroom, people who never wanted to be involved, people who suddenly couldn't stay quiet because they'd been targeted, too silenced, too pushed to the edge by contracts that didn't protect them but controlled them. And Justin tried to gather their voices to show the pattern, to prove that it wasn't isolated, that this wasn't a feud, it was a machine. But even as he tried, the pressure on them mounted. Their social media accounts were deleted overnight, their jobs put at risk, friends stopped calling, lawyers stopped replying, and one of them disappeared completely. No goodbye, no warning, just gone. And that's when Justin realized what he was really up against, not a person but an engine, powered by fear, masked by fame, and fueled by the belief that no one would ever look close enough to see the gears turning behind the glitter. And by the time they did, it would be too late, because Blake had already rewritten the ending, and justice was not part of the final draft. They came for his silence, not with threats, but with offers. They didn't demand, they tempted, they framed it as an opportunity, a resolution, a way to end the chaos for good. They called it a private settlement, a confidential agreement with no admission of guilt and a generous payout to cover emotional distress. Legal fees, damages, everything. Neatly packaged with an expiration date for truth and a permanent gag order, and they said it was for his own good. They said the headlines would fade. They said this was the only path left, and for a moment Justin Baldoni almost believed them because he was tired of the cameras that showed up outside his home, tired of the calls at midnight that never said anything, tired of the way people looked at him like he was the villain in someone else's story, and the silence from those who once swore they'd stand beside him hurt more than the noise, and yet he didn't sign because something in him still burned. Not with vengeance, but with refusal, with the knowledge that if he let this be buried, it would grow roots, it would twist through the industry, infecting others, silencing others, and the next time someone tried to speak up, they'd look at his story and fall quiet, because if he couldn't break through, then who could? So he walked away from the deal. Even though it cost him everything, even though his legal team warned him, he was throwing away the only protection he had, and the next day the headlines came faster, louder, more vicious, stories that didn't name sources, quotes that didn't exist, photos cropped and angled to frame him as erratic, unstable, dangerous, and while he tried to hold his ground, he felt the weight pushing harder. The machinery working overtime to erase him, to erase everything he stood for, and in the center of it all, Blake Lively remained untouched, pristine, untouchable, and in every public appearance she smiled, and in every smile was a message: no one will ever believe you. And he began to understand that this wasn't about the case anymore. It was about control, about legacy, and about fear. The fallout didn't come as fire, it came as silence, a different kind of silence, not the quiet before a storm, but the cold emptiness after one, when the damage is done and everything that mattered is gone. People stopped calling back, meetings were canceled without explanation, projects he had worked years to build were suddenly shelved, partnerships dissolved, and the industry that once welcomed him with smiles and handshakes now watched him like a stranger, like someone infected and untouchable, and still no one said her name, still no one acknowledged that Blake Lively had become more than a person. She had become a wall, a shield behind which power operated unchecked, unreachable, and unchallenged, and every time he tried to speak about it, to share even a fraction of what he had seen, the platforms cut him off, interviews were edited, posts were removed, articles were unpublished, and he began to see the edges of something far wider than he had imagined. This wasn't just about her, this was about a system that protected its own and punished anyone who tried to break the silence. And while she stood in that silence, trying to gather the strength to speak louder, she moved forward, her brand stronger, her image untarnished, deals signed, appearances made, awards accepted, and it was like none of it had ever happened, like his fight had been erased before it was ever written. And he wondered if this was the point, not to win, not to argue, just to exhaust him until he gave up, until he stopped fighting, until he became the warning for anyone else who thought about challenging the narrative. And the most terrifying part was it was working. He could feel himself slipping, doubting, second-guessing, questioning everything he once believed in. And he didn't know if he was losing or if he had already lost, because when the truth is invisible and the lies are louder, no one remembers what really happened, only what they were told, and what they were told was not his story. He started to question not just the system but himself, because when every door closed and every voice faded, it became hard to tell whether the truth was ever enough. Maybe it never was, maybe it never mattered. And as Justin Baldoni sat in the one-bedroom apartment he had moved into after his home was sold to cover legal costs, he looked around at the boxes of evidence, the files no one would publish, the sworn statements, the recorded calls, the documents that tied everything together, and he wondered what any of it was worth if the world refused to see it. And the worst part wasn't the silence, it was the slow erosion of his own certainty, because when you're gaslit long enough, you start to believe the fire is your fault. And Blake Lively never needed to speak, because the world spoke for her, the media, the fans, the influencers, the executives, all echoing the same script of admiration and denial. And with every repetition, her innocence was reinforced, not because it was proven, but because it was familiar and easy and marketable. And what he was offering wasn't easy. It was messy, it was hard, it was uncomfortable, and people don't listen to the uncomfortable. Not when the comfortable wears diamonds and smiles for cameras and says all the right things at all the right times. And the deeper he went into his own isolation, the more he realized he was becoming invisible, not because he was wrong, but because he was inconvenient. Because his truth disrupted a profitable lie, and the machine that protected her didn't need to silence him directly, it just needed to ignore him until the world forgot. And every time he thought about walking away, he remembered the others, the people who had whispered to him in secret, who had cried in rooms with the doors locked, who had begged him not to stop, because if he stopped, then they were truly alone. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the system was never designed to destroy him outright. Maybe it was built to break him slowly until he broke himself. Something changed, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it was quiet and sharp, like a crack in glass that spreads too slowly to see but too fast to stop. It started with a leak, a document posted anonymously, not by him, not by anyone on his team, but by someone else. Someone inside a copy of an internal memo from Blake Lively's legal firm outlining media coordination with publicists and entertainment networks, a memo that detailed how narratives were to be shaped, how certain reporters were to be fed pertinent statements, and how stories were to be buried. And when the memo hit the internet, it didn't go viral, it didn't trend, but it landed in the inboxes of the right people. Journalists who had once been afraid now had something to lean on, and slowly pieces started to fall into place. Whispers became questions. Questions became threads, and suddenly other documents started appearing, photos, contracts, audio clips, and while none of it was conclusive alone, together it painted a picture, a disturbing, meticulous picture of control disguised as image management, of influence that reached beyond what anyone had imagined. And Justin Baldoni didn't celebrate because he knew what came next: retaliation, and it came fast. 3 more smear stories in the press, 2 cease and desist sent to bloggers, one of his allies fired without cause, and one of the witnesses who had gone public was now being sued for defamation. But this time, something was different. This time, people were watching, people were asking why the lawsuits always targeted the weak, why the stories disappeared so quickly, why no one from her side ever spoke directly. And for the first time, Justin wasn't standing completely alone, and he knew the machine was still running and the danger hadn't passed, but something had shifted. Because once a crack appears in glass, it can't be undone, it can be covered, it can be painted over, but it's still there, and sooner or later it spreads. It was in the hallway of a downtown building that everything truly shifted. No cameras, no microphones, no press, just an unexpected meeting arranged through a burner phone and a voice he hadn't heard in years. Someone who once worked on the inside, not just close to Blake Lively, but embedded deep in the machinery that protected her. And they didn't speak like enemies, they spoke like survivors. And what she handed him wasn't a smoking gun, it was something worse. It was a list, a black list of names. Names of creators, journalists, lawyers, whistleblowers, all of whom had at some point come too close to the truth or refused to play along. And next to each name was a notation: status suspended, reputation compromised, removed quietly. And among the names were a few Justin had already heard about, people who had vanished from the spotlight without reason, people he once thought had just moved on. Now he understood they had been moved out, and that list wasn't just a record, it was a warning. It meant everything he feared was true, that this wasn't a coincidence, it was a system, one built to outlast headlines, one designed to bury inconvenient voices beneath perfectly constructed careers and influencer smiles and charity galas. And now that he held that list, he couldn't look away. He couldn't walk away, and Blake Lively just got caught repairing the end. It wasn't a single document or one explosive headline that unraveled everything. It was the accumulation of quiet truths, this steady drumbeat of voices that refused to be erased, the creators who stood back up, the platforms that were forced to respond, the insiders who chose exposure over loyalty. And as Blake Lively remained hidden behind legal teams, behind silence, behind perfectly lit curated images, the world outside changed forever. The illusion shattered slowly, painfully, but completely. And now her name no longer meant power, it meant caution, it meant manipulation. It meant a system exposed for what it truly was, a machine built not to protect truth, but to punish those who spoke it. And while no courtroom ever called her guilty, the court of public perception delivered its own kind of justice, one that could not be reversed or bought or sealed, because the creators who suffered, the channels that vanished, the evidence that was silenced, had all become part of something larger than a scandal. They had become a movement, and now